And the first one is, I think, assume the person is intelligent.
We should always be trying to apply the principle of charity.
Assume they're an honest actor.
More often than not, when you don't apply the principle of charity to an argument and give it the strongest reading, you will be attacking a straw man.
Treat them how you would like to be treated in this conversation. And let's just say, most of the time, those conversations are absolutely awful.
Are there any other topics that you think would be of benefit in elevating conversations or reasoning ability that you think would be good to discuss?
There's a couple of things I could mention that are probably things that we should try and do. Going back to the problems I mentioned, you should actually be pragmatic with the conversation. If it's a topic that's important to you, it might harm you depending on the conclusion or anything like that. You should take the time to look into it and discuss it. But actually, if you don't really care about it, don't even bother getting involved in the conversation. Don't just go, oh, it's stupid, you're an idiot. Forget that. If you don't care about the conversation, just don't have it. But I think if it's things that you do care about or could affect you in some way, or your family, your friends and so on, then you should think about the way you go forward. And obviously think about the types of reasoning that we've discussed already in the pitfalls, and try and make sure what you say is at the very least cogent. But when you're dealing with people, I think there's some things that we can do and we should try to do to ensure that we are having as good of a conversation as we can. And the first one is, I think, assume the person is intelligent, even if what they say seems a bit disjointed, right? Maybe they're not speaking in their first language, or
that's something I always consider. Yeah.
You got to try. I mean, and start off with that and keep persisting it with, assuming they're intelligent, and also assume they're an honest actor. Assume that they are genuinely looking to have this conversation with you. They're not looking to just beat their chest and go, haha, I'm right, you're irrational, you're wrong, or whatever. Assume that they're actually there for the conversation. Treat them like a human being. Treat them how you would like to be treated in this conversation, right? And you want to be treated as if you're intelligent, as if you're an honest actor. Treat them the same. Have a proper conversation with them instead of trying to win points in debate. Don't let your experiences with other people of a similar position, like Sarit. So say you speak to a lot of fundamentalists or a lot of creationists, young earth creationists, and let's just say most of the time those conversations are absolutely awful, and you have this new one pop up and want to talk with you. Don't assume that they're instantly like that person. We see it far too often that people will relate religion to Christianity, and Christianity to fundamentalism, and fundamentalism with biblical literalism. And I've proved biblical literalism wrong, and that therefore all religion is false. And you're like, again, that this bad reasoning going on there. And you can say the same sort of thing when you're dealing with people. Every creationist that I've spoken to so far has been absolutely awful, so therefore they all are. Well, no, take the time, treat each person as a new person, as a blank template. In fact, even if one of them who you spoke to before comes back to you, and this isn't like a regular thing, but they actually try and have a conversation with you, give them another chance. Sometimes they're worth it. Maybe they were having a bad day before, they or you might have been in an emotional state. And that's another thing that can get in the way of the reasoning process. If I'm angry, if I'm feeling grumpy, if I've had a bad night's sleep, I will be less receptive to new information. I will be more prone to thinking you're wrong, just because I'm in a bit of a grumpy state. You might not be wrong. It's actually me that's in the wrong there. My emotions are getting in the way. So if you're in that state, try and be aware of that state and take a step back, remove yourself from the conversation, say, I'm not feeling good today. Can we have this conversation another day? don't be combative at all. Stop trying to win points in debate and get, pats from all the other people on your team. Forget about this tribalistic us versus them mentality. Try and hold a conversation where you're both on a journey searching for truth together. Try and understand each other's perspectives. And do you know what? You may disagree with them, they may disagree with you, but you might find that actually you agree on a hell of a lot more things. I've got a young Earth creationist friend that I met through Twitter, right? And apart from the young Earth creationist stuff, we are very, very alike. And he's an absolutely great guy. And we have a lot of conversations about things. And actually, we just forget about the young Earth creation and stuff. Because you know what? He's never going to convince me, and I'm never going to convince him on this topic. There's nothing that pops up unless there's some new science that actually proves it one way or another. Will I be convinced? And he's already rejecting the science on this particular topic. So therefore, there's no point in us having this conversation. But we can talk about a number of different things. We can look at both our own tribes and each other's tribes and have these conversations and talk about our behaviors and talk about, I got really annoyed the other day and I did this thing, have all these conversations. How could I have done this better? What do you disagree with in this article? And so on and so forth. So take the time to listen and understand the person, not just their particular position, but more about them, how they came to their conclusions and their justifications for their belief. And if they bring up something that you don't know, feel free to admit ignorance. I don't know that. You know what? I'm going to have to take some time to read this. I don't have some time right now. But if this is an important part of the conversation that we're going to have a few days to read it and we'll have to come back to this. If not, then, we'll have to move on. But you have to bear in mind, I don't know this bit. There's nothing wrong with admitting you don't know, especially if you're the sort of person who is going to be willing to look for more information on the topic. And if they provide you some reading material, sometimes I think it's worth reading. In fact, more often than not, it's worth reading it. Now, I will go against myself there and I'll say, based on a site like Answers in Genesis, I will, tend to avoid a site like that because I've spent a lot of time reading their articles, and when they're discussing science, it's really bad, really, really, really bad. So if they're bringing up something scientific based on my previous experience, and if someone says, yeah, check this proves creationism, and they give me a link to Answers in Genesis, generally, I don't care enough about the conversation. If I still got involved in those conversations and was trying to convince creationists that their belief is in error, then yeah, I would carry on reading it. But it's not a conversation I care about anymore. And so for that sort of conversation, I wouldn't get involved in it. And if someone starts spamming me with links, it just, it's not worth it. But if it's a conversation that you're interested in, say you're really interested in morality or artificial intelligence, and they give you a link and say, oh, what do you think about this new theory that's just come out about this thing? Oh, yeah. And you spend the time reading it and take time over your responses. One of the benefits with the internet and social media is actually you don't have to respond right away. And you can write and rewrite a response. Obviously, in a conversation like we're having now, there isn't exactly as much time to respond because it's a live conversation like it's in the real world. But that's not the same with when you're on Twitter. You don't have to give that response right away. And I know that there is that temptation. I have to respond. But actually, if you feel that you need to respond, then just say, I need to think on this some more. I'll come back to this in a bit, rather than give your response right away. And I think that is something that we all do badly. I don't think, I can't talk. I don't think any of us take enough time over our responses and don't fully take the time to understand each other and what the person is saying. Quite often, I think that we assume what they're saying is what they're saying without taking the time to actually clarify. And we all think we're being clear when we say certain things, but quite often you'll see people using certain terminology and you'll say, how can that be the case? No, I wasn't saying that. Okay, but this word means this. You go, okay, if we had taken that conversation differently, I'd have gone, when you say this, how are you using the term? Da 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 da. Oh, okay. That's a bit atypical to how it's usually used, but let's go with that. I understand your position on the topic. And all of a sudden, you've changed the dynamic of that conversation.
Very good. That is very good advice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dave.
Yeah, I think principle of charity is something that's missing from a lot of discussions. We should always be trying to apply the principle of charity to our interlocutors' arguments. So, like an argument that, like when you hear the Kalam, a lot of atheists will say, well, that's not an argument for God. And that's because they're not giving it the best possible reading. Sure, it doesn't actually have the word God in it, but it's part of a bigger argument. So they're not applying the principle of charity to that. And they think just by saying God's not in the argument, therefore it's not an argument for God. You're not really giving the argument justice, and therefore any kind of argument that you give against it isn't going to be a good argument. More often than not, when you don't apply the principle of charity to an argument and give it the strongest reading, you will be attacking a straw man of that argument. And we should be trying to avoid that if we're going to be, giving our best to something. Another thing is, like Joe mentioned, fallacy bingo. There's a lot of people who will just yell out fallacies and then think the argument is done. But a fallacy, unless it's in a formal fallacy, most informal fallacies don't guarantee that the conclusion isn't true. It's just that the reasoning that's got there doesn't guarantee the conclusion. And you still have to kind of point out why the reasoning is fallacious. So you need to kind of apply that a bit better if you're going to be a good reasoner. And you also have to be honest with yourself. Like, one of the hardest things is to be honest about our own arguments and our own conclusions. The example you brought up with Calvinism earlier was a perfect example. Most people reason to Calvinism and then stop there. So to be a good reasoner, you have to be honest with your conclusions as well. And going back to the Kalam thing, make sure you're interrogating the argument properly. Because if you're not interrogating the argument properly, you're not actually arguing against that argument. And another important thing is to actually learn about the topics. It's too easy to fall into a Dunning-Kruger situation where you think you know everything about the topic because you've heard a few words passed around. But hearing a bunch of people say a bunch of words doesn't necessarily mean that those people are actually using it correctly. And when we're stuck in our kind of echo chambers, might not be the right word, but when you're stuck in a big group that all use the term the same or make all these arguments, like to prove it, you can't prove a negative. That's quite a popular one within the atheist community. But if you actually go out and look, that's a completely false argument. So a lot of the times people don't actually check the information that's coming from the people that they like and admire. They just accept it. And to be a better reasoner, you really need to look at these popular sayings and go, well, are these actually correct? Many of us we're so focused on the other side that we think, well, I'm smart, they're dumb, therefore what I say is smart, and what people like me say is smart, therefore it must be correct. There's too much of that kind of goes on.
Yeah.
And another thing is pick up a book on logic if you're interested in it. There's one called Logic from Wilfred Hodges, which is a really good basic introductory text. And I think it's called Introducing Logic by Shufan Lee. That's another great one to pick up, and it's very in-depth.
Dave, after the stream is over, if you could send me a couple of links to those books, I will add those to the description.
Yeah, no worries. I'll send you a message on Twitter with.
Okay.
Yeah, I think what Dave also mentions there, is talking about some of the us versus them mentality. It's one of the things that we've tried to do by addressing bad atheist arguments and bad atheist memes and things like that, both on our blog and on our channel, and even in conversations on Twitter. And we're atheists ourselves. We believe gods don't exist, but we notice that there are some errors in reasoning, and we do our best to explain why these errors in reasoning are. But instead of having that conversation, people get into that combative mode and then other us and, oh yeah, you're clearly theist trolls, or you're apologists, you're cult leaders, or
Okay.
Yeah, I get that a lot. I must be a theist in disguise because I'm arguing against other atheists.
Well, thank you very much, Dave and Joe, for joining me. This has been an excellent conversation, and I think it's a really great way to help us elevate our conversations.